Hi class, this is the final part of our lecture on sex offenders. In this lecture we're going to talk a little bit about evaluation, management, and treatment. So let me scroll through our slides. We had talked about child molesters and also rapists. Okay. This is Jesse Temendiquas. Is a mugshot, if you couldn't figure that out already. But Jesse Temendiquas is the individual who raped and murdered a young girl in Hamilton Township, New Jersey, down in Mercer County, named Megan Kanka. And as a result of that crime, Megan's parents pushed for new legislation that would notify the community when a sex offender moved to their community or to their location, and that is known as Megan's Law. So maybe you were aware of the origin of that law, maybe you were not, but we're going to talk a little bit about Megan's Law here. And on Canvas, there's some information about Megan's Law you should review as well. But basically, Megan's Law requires the states to release information relative to an offender as deemed necessary to protect the public. That's kind of the spirit of the law. So different states and different jurisdictions have different ways of carrying out Megan's Law. So all states now have a sex offender registry. And the way the registry works is you can go in and type in a zip code or an address, and you can look at sex offenders who are living in the vicinity. There's a link to the New Jersey Sex Offender Registry on Canvas if you want to take a look at your own community. But that's probably the most popular way that Megan's Law is enacted in the United States, is a sex offender registry. One of the problems with the registries is they are notoriously, a lot of them are inaccurate. So they need constant updating. So and it's usually done at the county level. So for example, I know Passaic County, New Jersey has a Megan's Law office, and that is run out of the Special Victims Unit prosecutor's office. And that office, the Megan's Law office there, is responsible for updating the website and, tracking sex offenders who live in Passaic County, New Jersey. So presumably all different counties in New Jersey have a Megan's Law office. And some of them are probably better than others. Some of them are probably more update than others, and they all probably submit information to the state's registry. So there are always going to be gaps, and there are always going to be lags in the system. So just remember that when you take a look at the registry, it's not necessarily 100% accurate. There's also a National Sex Offender Registry, which is also suffers from the same problems. I mean, sometimes sex offenders, they're usually required to register when they move, but sometimes they don't, and it's very difficult to track. And to make sure the registry is 100%. So the registry is one way of managing sex offenders in enacting Megan's Law. Another way is community notification, where if a sex offender moves into a community, the Megan's Law office will issue some type of statement to the community. It could come as an automated voicemail that goes to your phone. It could come as a flyer. So not all jurisdictions use community notification in that form, but some do. And you could argue that the sex offender registry is community notification. There are a number of other ways to manage sex offenders. Some sex offenders have lifetime GPS tracking. And of course, there are residence zoning laws, which vary by jurisdiction and municipality, but they essentially state that, for example, a sex offender cannot live within 1,000 feet of a school or 1,000 feet of a park. The problem with those laws, though they sound like a good idea, is they often leave very little place for these people to live, and these people do need to live someplace. And what happens is they end up, homeless or congregating in a public space. There was a real famous situation in Miami, Florida, where all the sex offenders were living under a bridge because there was no other place to live in Miami-Dade County. So it's a real problem, and the rights of the public do have to be protected, but it also has to be balanced against the rights of the offenders. They do have to live someplace. They shouldn't force to be homeless. So resident zoning laws are controversial. GPS tracking can be effective, but needs to be monitored. And it's not a guarantee that someone's not going to reoffend. Some states have, some legislatures have proposed, colored license plates, like pink colored license plates or yellow colored license plates for sex offenders, registered sex offenders. That's just probably not a very good idea. But these are some of the ways that sex offenders are managed. And again, residency restrictions are controversial. A lot of people understandably argue that we don't want sex offenders, living in our communities or anywhere near us. But again, they have to live someplace. So there's a lot of states have kind of rethought the laws and are trying to walk back some of the restrictions because they're pretty prohibitive, and they're have oftentimes created problems that were unintended. And we mentioned that we already talked about registration. There's a sex offender registry in New Jersey. There's also a national registry. We talked about community notification a little bit. So one thing we haven't talked about is SVP statutes. So SVP stands for sexually violent predator. And these are laws. Some states have these laws, some states don't. New Jersey does. New York does have SVP laws on the books. And these laws have been found to be constitutional. So basically, let me tell you how these laws work essentially. So someone is a sexually violent predator. Someone has a history of violence. They've committed very serious sex crimes in the past, and they are going to be released from prison because they have served their sentence. Well, what happens is they cannot be prosecuted for that crime again. That would be double jeopardy. That would be unconstitutional. So what happens is the state, instead of prosecuting them after they've served their sentence, they initiate a civil commitment procedure, which basically means that the person is released from prison for serving their regular prison sentence, and the state is attempting to have them civilly committed to a psychiatric facility until they're no longer a danger to themselves or a danger to society. So this has been very controversial for a number of reasons. There are plenty of people who argue that it's unconstitutional. These people have already served their prison terms. They should, if you want to keep them in prison, make their prison term longer. But it's unfair to essentially incarcerate them after they've completed their sentences. The other issue involves treatment here. So when a sex offender goes to prison, they are not necessarily guaranteed treatment. When a sex offender is committed through an SVP motion, the only way this is constitutional is if they receive psychiatric treatment. So typically the facility that they go to is like a psychiatric prison hospital, and that treatment is expensive. It's not cheap. And actually on Canvas, there is a short video from a local news station in Wisconsin that takes viewers inside a sex offender facility in Wisconsin called Sandridge. It's a short video, and it's a very good piece on what this facility looks like, how much it costs, and some of the controversies surrounding the SVP laws. So that is another way that society has devised to manage sex offenders. through civilly committing them through SVP laws. And so basically what would happen is if someone was incarcerated or sent to treatment through one of these laws, they go to prison, they serve their regular prison sentence, there's a civil commitment hearing. If the judge deems that this person is still a danger to society, they'll go to a psychiatric facility until they are deemed to be no longer a danger to themselves or other people. That's the way it's supposed to work, at least. So these slides here just basically tell you, state exactly what I just told you. So there are over the years, there have been a number of challenges to the constitutionality of the legality of these SVP laws, and they have been upheld as constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court as recently as 1997. So these laws, despite their controversy and their cost, are here to stay. So these are just a couple of slides showing you how expensive it is. It's very expensive to have someone civilly committed because, again, treatment is mandated. And, again, there's the video on Canvas that kind of goes through some of the different states and talks about the cost of SVP laws. It's expensive. One of the other issues is that predicting future dangerousness is difficult, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. So when we talk about future dangerousness, or we're talking about recidivism, or we're talking about predicting the likelihood that someone is going to commit another sex crime should they be released, and that is a very difficult thing to do, and that really kind of falls into the realm of clinical forensic psychologists who study sex offenders, evaluate them, treat them, and try to determine, they make recommendations to the court about who should be released and who should be further incarcerated based on future dangerousness. It's a very difficult thing to do. Now, in psychology, you've probably heard there's a very well-known saying in psychology that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, and that's true, but still there are high rates of false positive predictions when trying to predict any criminal behavior. And again, a false positive is when you say something is going to happen and it doesn't. A false negative is when you say something's not going to happen and it does. So a false positive would be if you claimed that someone was dangerous and they were going to reoffend, and so you put them in prison, and in reality they never would have reoffended. Now, that's a very difficult thing to prove. If they're locked up, how can you prove that they wouldn't have reoffended? But that would be a false positive. A false negative would be if you let a sex offender go because you didn't think they were going to reoffend, or there was a low probability of them reoffending, and then they went out and committed another crime. That would be a false negative. So, again, predicting future dangerousness is a very difficult thing to do. When we talk about clinical prediction, in general, clinical prediction is problematic. There are a lot of problems with clinical prediction. One of the problems with clinical psychology and its diagnosis is that there is no clinical psychologists rarely get any systematic feedback on their diagnoses. So, for example, if I'm a medical doctor, and someone is suffering, I think I have based on their symptoms, I think that they're suffering from, a particular disease, I can order tests to help me, determine what the correct diagnosis is. So there could be blood markers or enzymes or, x-rays, urinalysis. Those are all blood tests. Those are all different diagnostic tests that doctors have to help guide their diagnoses. Also, many diseases, and this is related to that, many diseases have biological markers that allow doctors to determine whether or not a disease is present. Many psychological disorders like bipolar disorder or depression, even schizophrenia, just don't have biological markers that allow clinicians to accurately diagnose these different disorders. It's a very difficult thing to do in clinical psychology. And that's really where the future of clinical psychology lies, in looking at these biological and genetic markers that help guide their diagnoses and thus treatments. But when we talk about clinical prediction or clinical decision making, the term clinical prediction refers to when the clinician relies on traditional methods of diagnosis combined with anecdotal experience and what we call clinical wisdom. So this is a very subjective form of clinical decision making, where the clinician is really basing their decision just on what they've seen in the past. There are no hard numbers. There's no objective concrete evidence to support their diagnosis, but based on what they've seen in the past, that's called anecdotal evidence, they make recommendations. And that is not a very good way to make a decision. A better way is called actuarial prediction. And actuarial prediction examines the empirical relationship between variables to predict future behavior. And it tends to be more reliable than clinical prediction, and it often relies on specific tests and instruments to predict who's going to reoffend. So a lot of clinical forensic psychologists who work in the area of sex offenders, a lot of their work is geared towards designing different tests to predict future dangerousness among sex offenders, to guide their diagnoses and also guide their treatment options. And a lot of that involves establishing reliability of these tests and validity, testing, with clinical populations. And those are actuarial instruments. So you're actually, basically what you're doing is you're looking at correlations. And actuarial prediction is very similar to how the university determines if you should be admitted to Montclair State. So they look at all these variables in your background. They look at your GPA. They look at the ranking of your high school, where you went. They may look at your standardized test scores, how difficult your classes were, all this stuff. And they put it into a regression formula, and that allows them to predict your success at Montclair State. The university is only interested in students who they think are going to graduate. So those are the students that they accept, and there's a cutoff. That's actuarial prediction. It's the same way that insurance companies set your insurance rates. So that tends to be a better technique of prediction than clinical prediction. Within actuarial prediction, when we talk about sex offenders, we can talk about static variables and dynamic variables. So static variables are things that don't change. That's what the word static in this context means unchanging. So these are fixed. How many times you offended in the past? That's not changing this moment, right? It might change in the future, but right now, when we're making our prediction, how many past offenses have you committed? 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are static. That's a static number. Age when you first committed your crime. That is a static number as well. And then you have dynamic predictors that may fluctuate or change over time with interventions. So this could be if you're a sex offender and you also abuse drugs and alcohol, that is a risk factor that is going to increase the probability that you are going to reoffend. But your management of your drug and alcohol problem can change over time with therapy. So that's called a dynamic predictor, and that's kind of what the word dynamic means changing over time. We also have stable variables and acute variables within the category of dynamic predictors. So stable, these things change over time, such as substance abuse, like we talked about. And also you have acute predictors, which change from day to day or moment to moment, such as whether you're drunk, whether you're sexually aroused. So these are all different types of variables that are used in actuarial prediction. So that just gives you a very, very brief overview of some of the more elementary key principles in predicting who's going to reoffend when it comes to sex offenders. It's a very difficult thing to do. So anyway, in this lecture, we talked about child molesters. I provided you with a typology of child molesters. We talked about the difference between child molesters and pedophilia. We talked about the nature of sex crimes. We also talked about rapists and different types of rapists, what the primary motivation for rape is, and we also talked about Megan's Law and some other options for treatment and assessment. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Make sure that you read the material on Canvas.